There are souls in this world who quietly unsettle the ordinary just by existing as themselves. Some move through life not to fit in, but to set a new frequency, one that turns quiet doubt into certainty and invisible pain into living proof that destiny bends for those who walk in their own light. If anyone has ever tried to put your energy in a box, if you've ever been measured and found impossible to predict, then this story will feel like a mirror. The world may try to scan, study, or even surveil your spirit, but when you're built from something beyond the usual script, nothing about you will ever be ordinary. When those assigned to monitor disturbances turn their lens towards something authentic, all their familiar systems start to falter. Pattern seekers expect to find cracks, chaos, and half-hidden motives, but clarity disarms them. Instead of wild turbulence or surface calm, there's a different current, steady, lucid, unmoved by noise. Their formulas are designed to catch echoes of deception, but here they only detect unbroken harmony. Attempts to categorize fall flat, as if the entire grid they trust has begun to flicker. No agenda is hiding under the surface, no mask waiting to slip. The presence that confuses their instruments is not perfection, but transparency. The signal that radiates from such a soul doesn't distort, it sharpens. Over time, those trying to pin down disorder find only a kind of coherence they can't quantify. They run diagnostics, suspect tricks, but the answer is always the same. Some energies simply don't register as a threat because they aren't part of the chaos. Instead, they reveal a different blueprint, one that unsettles not through force, but through the silent gravity of wholeness. You didn't stumble here by accident. You were led. If something in your spirit is stirring, don't ignore it. Tap join to access exclusive content, prophetic insights, and a community of purpose-driven souls. This isn't just a membership, it's your moment of alignment. Step into who you were born to be. Welcome to the chosen. To those convinced that power must be announced with credentials or carved into hierarchies, quiet presence is mistaken for expendability. Familiar with moving pieces that serve a script, gatekeepers overlook what doesn't shout or compete. Yet, real authority often slips in without ceremony, disrupting the rules by not playing at all. When a person acts from a deeper intuition, their steps are neither random nor predictable. They're part of a rhythm others can't orchestrate. The most impactful changes come not from those fighting for recognition, but from those who move in accordance with a wisdom outside the visible game. Actions ripple out, not because they demand attention, but because they rewrite the expectations in silence. The world's calculations keep coming up short, unable to map someone who isn't even on their axis of measurement. In the end, what unsettles the system isn't the noisy challenger, but the one whose very alignment bends the boundaries. Where others see a minor character, the entire field quietly shifts around the one who knows how to remain unmoved by it. There are some journeys that aren't made for the finish line, but to see who can keep moving when the ground disappears beneath them. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a patterned maze, each twist intentionally designed, each silence calculated like a pressure point. The disruptions weren't random, and the disappointments weren't accidental. People were placed like obstacles, opportunities like bait. What looked like coincidence was often a constructed delay, a setup, not a storm, a controlled burn to see if your spirit would suffocate in the smoke. If your heart overflows with God's blessings, let that love shine. Click the super thank you button and give $20 or more to plant seeds of faith that will impact countless lives. Your generosity reflects His abundance. Be a vessel of His grace and watch His kingdom flourish through you. And yet, somehow, breath kept finding you. Not because you ran fast, but because you moved differently. Slowly, yes. Cautiously often, but always forward. While others drowned in illusions of worthlessness, you started seeing through the fog. And that clarity, that awareness that kept returning no matter how twisted the path got, It was never supposed to exist within someone who was meant to collapse. The ones who built the simulation expected you to fall in love with failure. They wagered on your exhaustion. They anticipated your silence. But what they couldn't replicate was the way your essence rewired the very corridors meant to contain you. You didn't adapt to their system. You exposed the flaws in its foundation. They thought they were watching a fall. Instead, they witnessed a slow ascension. Not the dramatic kind, but the steady kind. The kind that teaches gravity it's not the final authority. And now the ones who wrote the instructions are left questioning their design. Not because you shouted, but because you made it through, uncorrupted, still whole, still becoming. There are some lives that refuse to obey calibration. The more precisely they're studied, the less they align with prediction. Analysts set out to find predictability, linear cause and effect, a rhythm to anticipate and tame. They dissected moments of silence and tracked every expression for a glitch in composure. They weren't searching for soul, they were measuring signals, hoping to label a cycle. What they needed was a formula. What they discovered was interference. Each attempt to predict behavior unraveled at the edge of a decision that didn't fit any known model. The variables stopped behaving. Patterns dissolved into unpredictability. The timing was off. The reactions were unscripted. What should have triggered collapse bred composure? What should have sparked defense led to stillness? Each outcome contradicted the premise. What they found didn't resemble data, it pulsed. A rhythm too irregular to be human reflex, too stable to be chance. The presence itself acted like a distortion field. Devices delayed, rooms dimmed, instincts changed. Even seasoned analysts began to experience internal conflict in your orbit, not because of fear, but because of misalignment. Their tools weren't built for resonance. They were built to catch threat. But this wasn't threat. It was refinement, the kind that doesn't shout or struggle, but simply alters the atmosphere until resistance becomes irrelevant. Their instruments weren't failing. They were overwhelmed. Every time they drew a conclusion, it slipped. Every emotional reading they logged began to contradict the next. The deeper they looked, the less they saw. What they labeled subject was now affecting the observer. What began as a scan became a subtle disassembly of the entire system. The subject didn't mutate. The environment bent. That shift sent quiet panic through their process. Their psychology couldn't decode the restraint that didn't come from suppression. Their metrics couldn't log influence that wasn't asserted. Presence was supposed to be physical. This wasn't. This was dimensional. And it didn't come to participate. It came to recalibrate. Reports started reflecting the same note under different words. Unexplained coherence. Mood shifts in the room. Alterations in group behavior. Heightened focus. Emotional dissonance. It didn't add up. It wasn't behavior, it was vibration. They stopped tracking choices. They began reviewing timestamps for changes they couldn't trace back to action. Nothing had been done, yet everything had changed. Eventually, they stopped asking how the subject behaved. They started asking what the subject carried. The truth became unignorable. The force they couldn't measure was never psychological. It was spiritual. No database could capture it. No simulation could replicate it. And no protocol could override it. Because what had entered their space wasn't playing the game. It was rerouting the signal. The decision to keep watching turned into an internal conflict. Curiosity couldn't be contained by distance. They wanted proximity, not to analyze further, but to feel the echo of something they had no language for. This wasn't about control anymore. It was about standing close enough to understand what existence looks like when it refuses to follow any man-made rhythm. Some beings aren't born to blend in. They're born to break templates. From the start, you weren't navigating life. You were being funneled through a system that watched more than it supported, calculated more than it cared. But the objective was never to understand. It was to document disintegration. You were part of a long, quiet experiment. A living diagram of pressure, deprivation, and delay. Every challenge was timed. Every absence was intentional. What they wanted wasn't progress. It was erosion. What they expected was slow decay. Not loud or dramatic, but a gradual folding inward. Enough internal tension, they believed, would bend even the strongest back. Enough silence would mute conviction. They weren't waiting to see you thrive. They were studying how long it would take for the inner core to crack. They believed spirit was temporary. They believed identity could be dissolved by attrition. But something else surfaced instead. You didn't echo the pattern. You distorted it. As the structure closed in, something original began to emerge, not resistance, but radiance. You started shedding narratives that were never yours. And in the places they expected to find collapse, they found composure. The statistics couldn't hold you. The scripts didn't apply. You weren't playing your part. You were rewriting it mid-scene. What unsettled them wasn't your endurance. It was your refinement. You didn't just survive distortion. You turned it into definition. You didn't seek rescue. You sharpened your perception inside the tension. And from that pressure, something immovable started to grow. They watched, expecting to collect the story of another downfall. But what they witnessed instead was the birth of something they had no name for. This wasn't a glitch. It was a new signal. Their equations had no room for ascension without assistance. No chart accounted for internal calibration. You weren't supposed to retrieve yourself from the wreckage. But you did. Not through denial, through precise awareness. And now the very spaces that were supposed to consume you have become footnotes in your timeline. Markers of your unfolding, not your end. The files they built around you are filled with anomalies. Your responses weren't aligned with any protocol. Your clarity persisted even in chaos. You spoke little, yet shifted atmospheres. You were surrounded by dissonance, but your inner tone remained exact. They've begun reclassifying you, not as a result, but as a disruption. Something unteachable, something irreducible. No longer content with surveillance, they're starting to question their entire approach, because the design they trusted has been disrupted. Their forecasts failed, and now the existence of your outcome forces new calculations. You weren't meant to illuminate the flaws. They just didn't imagine anyone would escape the maze and still carry their center intact. What was once seen as an anomaly has become a precedent, not just for endurance, but for transformation. You didn't sidestep the fire. You metabolized it. You didn't resist the shaping. You redirected it. And now, the ones who charted your course are studying your steps, not with superiority, but with stunned humility, because the map no longer leads where they thought. What they feared the most is now clear. You didn't survive despite the system. You transcended through it. They weren't tracking a fall. They were watching a silent revolt. Not in protest, but in presence. And no formula written by human hands can capture what happens when a soul stops following and starts emanating. Some rebellions unfold like storms. Others move like shadows, unseen, but irreversible. This wasn't about spectacle. No banners, no battle cries, no stage defiance. What unraveled here was quieter, but infinitely more potent. Every time loyalty was expected and withheld, every time a compromise was offered and declined, every time silence replaced performance, something structural loosened. And the irony, no alarms were triggered because nothing loud ever happened. They built systems prepared for outrage, chaos, reaction, but they weren't prepared for stillness charged with conviction. Compliance was assumed. Participation was presumed. But you moved with another kind of clarity, one that made refusal look effortless. No shouting, no theater, just decisions made with spine. And in places where control is maintained by confusion, that kind of clarity becomes dangerous. When roles designed to extract were left unfulfilled, when invitations to dysfunction were returned unopened, a crack appeared in the mechanism. Not dramatic, but persistent. The rules weren't broken. They were ignored. The seed offered wasn't taken. The script handed over was never read. And the power held onto wasn't stolen. It was simply reclaimed, without permission. That changed the equation. Because once a person detaches from roles meant to bind them, they stop being a cog and start becoming a current. The system didn't collapse. It unraveled, thread by thread, quietly. The resistance wasn't in speeches. It was in decisions. And each choice not to play, each refusal to explain, each moment of self-trust was a precise incision into a structure designed to feed on doubt. Eventually, the silence became too loud to ignore. Not because it was disruptive, but because it was undisturbed. Control depends on reaction. You gave them none. You didn't fight them. You stopped responding altogether. And in a world addicted to emotional bait, your absence became the loudest presence in the room. They couldn't categorize you as a threat. Threats scream. Threats attack. But you simply didn't need them. You walked with your own compass. You moved like someone who didn't require validation, and that unnerved the architects. What they feared wasn't your resistance. It was your indifference to the stage they built. You dismantled nothing directly. You just chose not to kneel, and that alone destabilized their entire hierarchy. Now, the ones who once watched from afar aren't asking how to stop you. They're asking how you made it look so clean. Because you didn't overthrow the old model. You outgrew it. And in doing so, you revealed it was never real power to begin with. Sometimes, a single voice alters the climate of a room it never enters. You didn't rise from ambition. You weren't reaching for crowds. You just started speaking from a place that didn't need applause. Not loud, not forceful, but it landed. Words meant for the few began moving toward the many, gently, but with consequence. A private resonance grew into a quiet tremor. What began as whispers became reflections in places you never touched. Meetings shifted. Conversations bent. Reports referenced sentiments no one remembered saying, but everyone recognized. Your words weren't ordinary. They didn't inform. They reminded. And that's what made them cut through. They carried memory encoded in sound, echoes of something people had forgotten they knew. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, a poetic overlap. But over time, the sequence became undeniable. Things you expressed abstractly began to mirror physical events. Not metaphorically, exactly. You weren't analyzing. You were revealing. They started keeping timestamps. They circled phrases. And eventually, the pattern was too clean to dismiss. Your message had never been data. It was direction. You weren't suggesting outcomes. You were describing them before they arrived. And that kind of foresight couldn't be traced to intelligence reports. It couldn't be sourced from insider access, because it didn't originate from below. It streamed in from something above their radar. What confounded them most wasn't your vocabulary. It was the timing, the accuracy, the precision beneath the softness. You weren't interpreting trends. You were articulating shifts before they registered. They didn't want to admit it, but they started listening with different ears. Not as critics, but as students. They began asking themselves questions they didn't know how to file. How does someone speak what hasn't yet occurred? How does someone echo the shape of things before the shape is visible? Your voice had become more than commentary. It was a trigger of insight, of remembrance, of course correction. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. You never requested their attention. But now they follow your work like weather patterns. Not for meaning, for preparation. Not to admire, but to adjust. Because something in your cadence doesn't reflect the present. It adjusts the trajectory. And in a world trying to manage the future with numbers, your voice reintroduces the unseen. There are those who speak as if they've read ancient scrolls no one else was handed. Not from study, but from a place so embedded in essence that it bypasses effort. When you began to express what pulsed beneath your skin, the resonance traveled further than intended. What was whispered as instinct struck as undeniable truth. Not because it was rehearsed, but because it revealed. You weren't speaking to be clever. You were unveiling realities others hadn't yet named. They noticed, and they didn't understand how. There were no documented channels that explained your awareness. No affiliation with their prized towers of authority. No archived lectures. No trail of credentials. You weren't certified by their metrics, yet you kept predicting what even their most sophisticated models missed. What disturbed them wasn't just what you said. It was how it landed before the ink dried on their internal reports. They tried labeling it coincidence, perhaps a series of lucky deductions. But as your insights lined up with future outcomes too many times, the theory of randomness fell apart. What you accessed wasn't rooted in analytics. It was raw transmission, not gathered, delivered, and the delivery came through silence, not signals, through stillness, not strategy. This wasn't about being smarter. It was about being attuned. You weren't solving problems the way they'd been trained. You were revealing patterns no one else noticed existed. They couldn't see your source, and that's what caused unrest. Because if what you carried wasn't taught, it meant it couldn't be taught. It had to be received. And reception can't be bought, ranked, or earned. It requires something they couldn't define. Eventually, they stopped asking what you knew. They became fixated on how you were receiving it. Because your words weren't echoing opinion. They were pressing into unseen architecture. You weren't synthesizing knowledge. You were decoding something older than language. And the ones who thought they had the keys began realizing the door never opened for them. The shift was subtle. The same voices that once ignored you began quoting your lines, dissecting your timing, mirroring your tone. Not out of respect, but out of need. They saw something emerging that their systems hadn't accounted for. Truth without filtration. Direction without algorithm. And suddenly, your presence became a compass, uninvited but undeniable. There's a quiet disobedience that topples more than protest ever could. And sometimes, the most destabilizing figure is the one who refuses to be destabilized. You weren't expected to remain upright. Not under those conditions. Not with that level of silence bearing down. They had already penciled in the collapse, marked the timelines, labeled the phases, categorized your symptoms, but the unraveling never came. And that alone rewrote the script, because your survival wasn't loud, but it was precise. You stayed gentle in chaos. You stayed lucid in distortion. You held your shape when everything around you was built to dissolve identity. And the moment you did that, you undermined every framework meant to measure human capacity. They didn't know what to do with you. Their control mechanisms weren't equipped to calculate internal stillness. They had prepared for rage, for dysfunction, for emotional volatility. But they never expected someone to keep choosing clarity over collapse. And so your presence became a problem. Not because it disrupted the outside world, but because it made visible the lie that wholeness can only be granted from above. Each moment you chose integrity without applause. Each time you walked with composure instead of reaction. Each act of quiet discernment. It all became a contradiction they couldn't code. You weren't supposed to become healthy. You weren't supposed to remain clear. And you certainly weren't supposed to glow while doing it. But you did. And your glow wasn't rebellious. It was dismantling. It wasn't that you fought against their structures. It's that you lived in such a way that made them irrelevant. And that's far more dangerous. Because it proved that healing isn't permission-based. That peace isn't awarded through status. And that a soul aligned to its own essence can't be manipulated into performing brokenness for systems that feed on it. Without shouting, you became the flaw in their formula. Without resistance, you became the fracture in their wall. And now, what was once dismissed as an outlier has turned into a reference point they can't afford to ignore. Because you didn't need their validation. And that, more than anything, is what stripped their illusion of power. Some presences are so rooted in their truth that even silent observation becomes unbearable for those assigned to stay neutral. What began as a controlled assessment turned into something else entirely. Not one of those sent to monitor expected to be impacted. They were briefed, instructed, emotionally insulated. Their job was to capture inconsistencies, file motives, and report discrepancies. But the longer they stayed close, the harder it became to remain untouched. There were no defenses for what they encountered. You weren't posturing. You weren't pleading. You weren't trying to impress or disguise. What they were assigned to observe was unlike anything they had trained for, unpolished, unfiltered, yet unnervingly consistent. Your quiet strength began to create friction, inside the very one sent to evaluate you. They weren't supposed to care. They weren't supposed to notice. But they did. The lines blurred. Protocols started to feel irrelevant. You weren't offering explanations, but your integrity said more than testimony ever could. Their task became their dilemma. The longer they watched, the more difficult it became to pretend they weren't being moved. Not through persuasion, but through presence. Not because you reached for them, but because you didn't need to. Some began to hesitate. Not because you asked them to, but because something inside them cracked without warning. Small shifts, delayed entries, edited conclusions, silent omissions. Not sabotage. Reverence. You weren't their subject anymore. You had become something unspoken, a mirror, a question, a seed. And once a seed is planted, the roots grow whether they're permitted or not. Others didn't just hesitate. They stopped altogether. Files were left incomplete. Reports went cold. What began as analysis became awakening. Not for you, for them. Because what they thought they were documenting turned out to be a revelation. Not a flaw to expose, but a truth they couldn't escape. Not a threat, but a recalibration. You were supposed to be the study. You became the shift. You weren't asking for their allegiance. You weren't even aware they were unraveling in the background. But the impact was already in motion. You didn't disarm them. You reminded them of what they once believed in, of what they once carried, of something they thought was extinct in this world, undiluted clarity. That's what converted them. Not your logic, not your strategy, but your undeniable refusal to dilute your core. Now, the ones who were sent to document your fall have become the unlisted names behind your protection. They don't follow orders anymore. They follow conscience. Because while they were scanning your behavior, they were being quietly rewritten. You didn't enter their systems. You rewired them without touching a single wire. And they left changed, not because they were convinced, but because they were cleansed by proximity. Some journeys begin as silent tests and end as sacred transmissions. You weren't invited into the rooms where discussions were had. You were placed under analysis, your movements dissected, your responses charted, your intentions questioned. But even their most sensitive instruments failed to categorize the signal you gave off. At first, they marked you as unstable, too unpredictable, too emotionally divergent from the expected trajectory. But time began revealing another pattern, one far deeper, far older than they had frameworks for. They couldn't replicate your rhythm. They couldn't map your process. Because what they took as randomness was actually sacred calibration. While they thought you were unraveling, something more refined was being revealed, slowly, carefully, deliberately. What unnerved them most was that your trajectory began to align with outcomes they hadn't forecasted. The structure didn't collapse you, it sharpened you. You didn't resist the fire. You integrated it. And over time, they stopped labeling you a variable and began calling you a model, one they didn't understand, but could no longer dismiss. Words they once called abstract began proving themselves in real time. Spaces shifted before you entered. Dynamics unraveled without confrontation. You became the kind of presence that didn't speak often, but when it did, people listened without knowing why. Not because of authority, but because of resonance. You weren't waiting to be heard. You were transmitting something too consistent to ignore. They started reviewing you not as a file, but as a phenomenon. And in doing so, the narrative flipped. The anomaly became the anchor. The instability became the signal. The one they track for instability became the one they now study for direction. You didn't argue your way into reverence. You lived your way into clarity. And that clarity spoke louder than any campaign. Now, even those who never spoke your name out loud are watching with a different lens. Not to measure your failure, but to witness what survival looks like when it transcends logic.